Welcome to the Food Junkies Food Addiction Summit.
Here we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction.
The purpose of this summit is to educate you and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution.
Every day for the month of October, we are sharing one inspiring speaker or highlighted food preparation video from the incredible Tony Vasallo of Moda Nutrition Inc. and the Real Food Revival Movement.
We have 4 weeks of interviews with the leaders in the field of food addiction, clinicians who are working on the front lines, registered dietitians and nutritionists that are working toward bridging the eating disorder and food addiction camps, and people just like you and me.
Here we talk about all things food addiction recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive.
So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
And as Vera always says,
the power is ours.
Thank you for being with us today here on the Food Junkie Summit. We have Heidi and Jen from the UK. And Heidi, I don't know if you'd like to start, but if you two would just go ahead and introduce yourselves and kind of give us some background, that would be wonderful.
Okay, I will start, but I'm going to start by correcting you, Molly, because I'm not from the UK. I am in the UK, but I come from Norway, and I have to get the record straight there. Yes, so I've come into food addiction and in fact into nutrition later in life. I'm actually originally a chemical engineer, spent most of my life, my career in business and engineering related business, and then retrained in nutrition a number of years ago now, but as a result of actually an experience related to food addiction, but I won't get into that now. Then Jen and I have trained together in food addiction under Bitten Johnson, and that's how we got to know you guys. So that's me.
Nice. And Jen? Yeah.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
So I'm a clinical psychologist by background. I've always worked in the NHS and worked in kind of health settings. So I work with people with chronic health conditions, like chronic pain, COPD, anything really. And then more latterly got into working with David, my husband, who's a GP. We had the crazy idea to help people reverse or put their type 2 diabetes into remission using nutrition. So that's a project that's been going on for about nearly 10 years now, actually. So we got into that by me getting into low carb, because I'm like Heidi, have my own story that we don't have to get into now, but I'm definitely a lifelong sugar and food addict. And I found kind of low carbohydrate keto probably about that same time, 10 years ago. And that's how we started doing that work, because it worked so well for me. I retired from the NHS a couple of years ago, trained with Bitten, the group that Heidi was in, and have since then, in the last 2 years, really been devoting my time to learning as much as I can about sugar and food addiction, so I can help as many people as I can, basically.
Awesome. Yeah, I really find that in this field, our profession has become our passion, which is like part of our recovery and helping others in this. So can you guys just share a little bit about how food addiction impacted your life and kind of what was your aha moment?
Oh, goodness. So for me, it wasn't, I can't call it an aha moment, really. It was a sort of a dawning realization of the fact that I had a problem and that it might be related to food. But it didn't start being related to food and I think that's partly because I never had a weight problem. So I basically ate what I wanted. And from when I left home, and what I therefore wanted to eat were mainly sugary foods. So I was living off, I remember in particular when I was based in Sweden for a while, I was literally living off white bread and I would buy these marzipan rolls things and chocolates and that kind of thing because I didn't put on weight. I thought, as everybody said to me, well, you don't have any problem, you can eat whatever you like. But then I started to lose my memory, lose my concentration ability, and that in itself, as I became slowly aware of that, it really started to impact my confidence in my work. And because I had an international career, and I had a lot of speaking appointments and stuff like that, and would lose track of what I was talking about. What we actually thought when I discussed it with my husband was that I possibly was getting an early onset dementia. And so I ended up having all the tests for that. That's partly because it was my mother was already diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and so I got tested for all of that. Was absolutely terrified of it. They didn't come up with anything apart from the fact that my self-confidence was absolutely at rock bottom. And so I then started to sort of search a little bit myself and eventually realized this would relate to the food. And it wasn't really till years later that I realized I had an actual addiction to the food, because what I started to do, of course, then was to try and make changes, and realized how incredibly hard it was. But yeah, so maybe you can say then my aha moment was later in life when I realized, when I started hearing the terminology food addiction. And I started thinking, maybe this relates to me. And then it was actually Jen who introduced me. And when we met a couple of years ago and said, why don't you join the Bitten Jonsson's food addiction course? And so, yeah, the rest is history. But yes, what an important part of a process to go through. I consider myself, when I consider with the people that I work with, I was incredibly lucky to realize it that early on in life. I work with a lot of people that are in their sort of early 60s, 70s even, and I was in my early 40s when I realized this. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Heidi. And Jen, can you share a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, lifelong earliest memories, food, particularly carbohydrate-y sweet things. Any pocket money would go on sweets. Whenever I met up with my best friend, we'd sneak off and get sweets and eat them. Yeah, it was a festival of carbohydrate whenever I could get it. And then, of course, that led into being an overweight teenager, which wasn't much fun at that time because there weren't a lot of overweight children at that time, and I was pretty overweight as a teenager. And then that, of course, led into that cycle of kind of dieting and then putting on weight, because the diets were always crazy. There were some really crazy diets around in the 70s and 80s, like grapefruit and egg, and you live on that and stuff like that. I mean, there was some really horrible things that you could never have maintained. So yeah, that was pretty horrible, really. And I was eventually reasonably successful in my late teens, so 16 onwards, but then it sort of went a little bit, like we were mentioning before we started the recording, it went a little bit anorexic at times because of that kind of buzz of losing the weight and that buzz that you get by kind of being a little bit in starvation mode. So that became a kind of oscillation then, really right up until kind of my 50s, I would say. I would always lose weight, kind of be really determined organized person who could do it, would get the latest scheme, whatever the latest scheme was, and I'd do it. I'd be successful, but then there'd be always this kind of regain. And then I'm not sure there was one specific aha moment, but I did start hearing about this term food addiction, and I was like, why haven't I kind of conceptualized it in that way? I'm a psychologist. We learned about addiction when we trained. I know all about addiction in other ways, and why didn't I recognize that was what I was doing was addictive behavior around certain foods, not around all foods. So that was a really marvelous moment in a way, because then of course you've kind of got a new route. You've got a new, because obviously that wasn't working. What I was doing before, that was never going to work in the long. Well, I suppose I could have carried on putting on weight and losing weight, but it felt very out of control and unsatisfactory, and not at all good for your self-esteem, because you kind of think, why am I doing these things that I don't want to do? As a psychologist, I should be able to work this out. So found low carb and keto, as I say, about 8 or 9 years ago, and that was part of the answer, as it is for most people. It really helps, but there was still that, because I didn't really understand it, there was still that drift into keto baking in the beginning. Yeah, then realized I had to cut that out. Other things along the way. Yeah, so really it was, again, like Heidi, through those conversations with Bitten, and then doing the training, really solidly understanding it from my own point of view, but also, seeing it and being able to sort of help other people through that as well. So it's been a long journey, and I think that's probably the same for all of us. And well, it continues. I think that's the one thing that I've learned: the journey is never over, and it's important to accept that there isn't an answer. It's a chronic condition. Like, I used to work with people with other chronic conditions like pain and headache and COPD, and they have to learn to manage those conditions in their lives and get the best quality of life that they can. And it's the same for us.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point that, so many of us, we were wondering, right? And we're like trying all these different things to find the solution for so long. Then we're like, aha, food addiction. Aha, I have it. And then there's this expectation, I think, that like, okay, it's all going to be better from here. Okay, I have an answer, there's a solution, and it's just going to be better. And then I won't have to keep fighting, or I won't have to keep working so hard, or whatever it might be. But the truth is, like you said, this is a chronic disease, in that at least it's, lifelong. It's not always going to be progressive. I mean, they say it's progressive, but certainly we have found when people, are working a program of recovery, that progression is considerably slowed, if not stunted, all that kind of stuff. So that brings me right into our next question, because as you ladies know, we've invited you here as for our clinician week, because we really want to know, as clinicians in this field, how do you work with clients? What works best? What doesn't work well? And, whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
I'll let you go first now, Jen.
Shall I go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I haven't worked with loads of one-to-ones. I've done some, but mostly I would say, in my expertise generally in my previous work, was around working in groups, and I love working in groups. I think groups bring a special magic, and especially to this field, because of that sense of isolation, that sense of feeling you're the only weird one. All of that is sort of taken away when you put people in a group of people with the same experiences. So I would say, where possible, if we can, I mean, obviously we need to look at the data about whether that's working, but my feeling is that where people are happy to, it's great to get them into a group, even if they need a bit of one-to-one to get them to that point. I think group work, both for the sort of treatment phase, but also for the sort of long-term recovery. I think it's great to have that sort of group input. So in terms of what works, that would probably be my one takeaway.
So what you found that doesn't work so well in your experience?
I don't know how to answer that, really. What doesn't work well? I think you just take every person as they come, don't you? With that, and I was talking to Heidi about this before. It's so hard to predict, actually. I think you just have to go with the flow. So I'm thinking of one guy that came through David's practice, who on paper, and this often used to happen to me in clinical work, was on paper they looked like heart sink central. So he was really overweight. He was like 26 stone or something, which is, super obese. He was drinking, he was smoking cannabis. He was sitting in his room playing on Xbox games all night. He could hardly walk because of pain. He was only a young guy. He couldn't sleep at night. He had sleep apnea and everything. So on paper, he looks like, addiction interaction, really in a bad way. He had a really tragic thing had happened in his life as well. So there was kind of a trauma there. But actually what happened was I did the sugar assessment on him. We talked about addiction. We talked about how they interact. We talked about, the food plan. And do you know what? He just went away and did it. I don't think I ever saw him again. David sees him occasionally because he goes there to get weighed. He's lost over 10 stone. He stopped drinking. He stopped smoking. He's doing Couch to 5K, which is a program you can do on your phone to get running. He's playing with his stepdaughter. His life was utterly transformed with very little input, and you wouldn't have necessarily predicted that. And then there's other people I think that you see where, they kind of seem really motivated. And yet change is really difficult for them. They really, really struggle with change, or they change for a while and then anything will kind of knock them off course. So I think it's hard to predict. I think you just have to work with where they are and try and get the next step, would be my philosophy on it.
Yeah, thank you. And Heidi, how do you work with clients? What do you find works best? What do you find that doesn't work so well?
Okay, so Jen and I work together in a number or a couple of settings, but and I completely agree with what Jen's saying, that group, my preferred way of working. Of course, we're not hugely experienced here. We have to add that fact. We are learning as we go as well in this process, and I think that's probably the most important thing to me at the moment with some of the work we're doing together, is trying to identify what is it that does work, and try and be sensitive to not just pushing through our agenda, but actually looking at what's actually happening to the individuals that are part of these groups. Are they managing to get to grips with their challenges, and is their life improving as a result of it, their quality of life and their control and freedom from some of these the addictive foods that they've been struggling with. But so what would I add? I do also work with one-to-ones, so I do have one-to-ones with clients, and I do find that there are some people that say, they'll come to me and they'll say, I don't want a group, I don't want to get involved in a group, don't try and convince me to do that. So then I won't do that. I will actually work with them in a one-to-one setting. But I always, as a matter of course, say, you are, as my private client, you have access to join one of my groups, and I'd love you to join the groups, and I'll describe the groups. And I try to also, when I'm working on my own, I work with quite small groups. So I like to have sort of maximum 6 or 8 people in the groups. That I feel works really well. It's of course it's quite time consuming working like that, but when people who've come to me and have said and have maybe had a few sessions with me in one-to-ones, then eventually say, oh, okay, yes, no, I'll come and have a look and just see if it's anything for me, and they do join. They always benefit from them. So that's my experience so far. So the sharing, the fact that they, even after having had a couple of sessions and maybe feeling comfortable with me, that experience of that Jen was referring to, of, oh, maybe I'm not so unusual, maybe I'm actually not alone. And my goodness, these people, and they'll come back to me as individuals and say, no, I just didn't realize that somebody, that she said exactly what I've experienced. And that's a wonderful thing. So groups, yes, absolutely. So far, I would say groups are a very, very good way to go. People share and listen and experiment more with what they're trying to do themselves, I think, when they get input from each other. What I'm conscious of with groups, though, more and more so, is making sure that the people in them gel. I must admit, I've had a couple of occasions where I've had some very dominant people, and then it's and maybe some people who have really struggled with negativity. You know, somebody like Jen, you always work on the positives, you know, positive psychology, and that's the way I love to work as well. You know, we're looking at solutions, we're looking at where to go from here, what do we want next, type thing. But sometimes when you get people that really struggle to do that, it's very hard to deal with that if you don't do one-to-ones, because you effectively have to get that person somehow, get that person interacting positively. So that's the negative side of groups, and means that you have to work a little bit to get the group to gel. I know I'm going on a bit now, but I was thinking what you were asking. Can I answer the second part of the question as well? You were asking.
Absolutely, please.
So one of the things that I feel doesn't work, but you can make it work, is when people come to you and they say, "Give me a food plan." That's what I'm expecting from these food addiction counselling sessions. You know, give me a food plan. Tell me what to eat. And it happens surprisingly often, I find. Of course, people are so into that diet mentality, aren't they? That's our culture. You described it beautifully, Jen, but that's what our society does. That's the norm. So to try and get away from that, and that's what we're doing together, isn't it, Jen, in our group sessions now, trying to get people to input to, it's not give me a food plan, but let me get some help to develop my own food plan. So that's and so in other words, I think that the part of that is that the prescriptive side is never going to work. To prescribe to people in this context is going to work for a period, just like a diet works for a period, but long term, people have to really be motivated and want it themselves. So yeah, that's the kind of things that I'm worried about. And then one other thing, which is when we and we see that in our groups together as well, is that people who commit and then decide to that they're going to actually do some self-analysis and do some, how does this work for me? Those are the people that actually will succeed. Those people will succeed. Whereas if you're just doing it as continuous lectures with people, then that's not going to work well. You need that. People need to have that buy-in, that will, that determination to make it work for me.
Yeah, change your food, then change your life.
Yeah.
So coming out of Bitten's course and then going into practicing in the field, is there something or a few things that both of you have found you needed to be a little bit more flexible with, that you thought it was going to be like this, and then it actually turned out to be a little different? So is there anything that you have changed in the way you practiced or over time, or things that really were different from the academic application to the practical application?
I think for me, it's around, it's definitely around patience. I'm not a very patient person. So I think it's really about applying that lifelong kind of model, and that we might be with somebody for part of their journey. That doesn't mean we have to get them all the way there. You know, this is kind of, as we were already saying, this lifelong journey. I think a couple of years back, I too was still in what Molly was saying about, you know, maybe there's an answer and it'll all be fairy dairy land. So yeah, I think it's important to kind of express that to people as well. You know, that is a lifelong, it's going to be a lifelong thing to manage. That doesn't mean you can't be successful, but you've got to keep learning, you've got to keep trying things, and that will change over time what you need to do. So yeah, so I suppose patience and you know, really taking that long-term view is something that I'm increasingly understanding.
Mm. Yeah, I think from my side, yeah, of course, everything you've said is correct. I think I started with because I retrained in nutrition, then I did the I don't know whether any of you have done that, but thought, okay, I know this now. I know what needs to be done. I know this is what I do. Yeah. So we talk about, you know, what are the right foods and get the right balance, get the right, you know, building blocks for body and brain, get the right minerals and vitamins, look at food diaries, help people to get the food right. And you sort of wonder, why isn't it working? And then realize that, well, actually, and then you realize, actually, you should have realized this because you've yourself gone through the process of, it's not that simple. It is actually, there is some really basic problem here that is stopping people from being able to just work with the foods. So yeah, I think that's probably for me, and that's an embarrassing realization, actually, because you think I should have known better because of my own experience, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think you bring up such a great point, Heidi, in that, like, I remember early on in my days, early in when I was brand new to mental health and substance abuse, working in the field, right? I remember just having this fear all the time of like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? People are still sick. I'm doing it wrong, right? Like, just always having these thoughts. And then, you know, you get these years of experience and you're like building. And then one day I felt like the light bulb came on for that too, for me, you know, not just like about like my personal food addiction story, but like, oh, right. And then I was like, then ego all of a sudden, right? So it was like ego first, and I was like ego again, but it was like the flip of it. And I was like, oh, I know what to do. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute, back that up again. Like, wait a minute. Yeah. No, I mean, embarrassing or not, I think that's personal development. I think that's growth. I think that's, not only does that happen in our personal journeys, it happens in our professional journeys, you know. So I am going to ask the next question that is going to tap a little bit into ego, and I don't want anybody to be embarrassed to answer, for sure. But, you know, what do you guys feel like you offer to the field of clinical work in food addiction that's unique?
Okay, shall I go?
Yeah.
A couple of things really, and I know you do this as well, Molly, but I think the solution focused model works incredibly well, because it kind of meets people where they are. It's all about what's important to them and what's the next little, you know, next little tiny thing that you might do, some sort of action step. I think this, you know, we all know how important it is. Like Heidi was saying, people have to make it, you have to make a change, because if you carry on, you know, things stay the same if you don't make a change. So I think solution focus works really, really well. It's very person-centered, very non-judgmental. So it's not unique because there are other people doing it, but I don't think everybody uses that model. And because that was the model that I've been really seated in for my professional career, it kind of just transfers really well. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is, for me, it's always been important to be an academic, and I have had phases in my career where I've worked in academic settings, written academic papers, supervised people doing doctorates, I've got my own doctorate, etc. So bringing that lens to the field, which I think certainly there's a lot of research around sugar addiction, but and food addictions, not so much around the practice, hardly anything actually about what works. So I think that's something, again, I'm not unique in that, but I think it's something that I can really bring, which is that lens, you know, supporting the project that we're all working on together, being able to kind of look at the literature that has been published and critique it and summarize it, and can I present it to other people, hopefully to be able to write up papers on stuff we're doing and disseminate. I'm so sorry, somebody's trying to ring me there. Yeah, and disseminating that, and yeah, so I think that's something else unique that I can bring.
From my side, gosh, anything unique? I again, I would say I don't think I necessarily bring anything unique to the table. One of the things that's very important.
So sorry.
One of the things that is really important to me, though, that I think works is that, and maybe that's to do with my original background in engineering, which is, having to understand the why before doing the what. So that's something that I try very much to bring to everything that I do, is to, even with people who come and say, just tell me what to do. I always try to get away from that. I won't challenge it head on, but I will still try to get to a point where I can see that the individual is going to have some level of interest, so that we can probe into the whys. And of course that relates to how why people come, what are their motivations for coming. But I that's important to me, is to understand, for people to understand their own physiology and how it relates to health and well-being, or to understand how it relates to pathology and ill health. So, to understand, to be able to make the links to what we eat and what that substance is actually then doing. What role does it have? Does it have a role? So, if you can sort of get the hook right, that interests people, I think that is something that is important. I don't think I'm unique. I'm sure there are lots of people that bring that to the table, but my own personal interest in the sort of biochemistry of what's going on in food addiction makes me very determined to include enough of the whys there to help people even if for nothing else, to be able to remember it. When you know the why, you understand the why, it's easier to remember and to engage in it. So
yeah, it sounds like you guys make a great team. I'm wondering if you guys can speak a little bit about the individuals that you see that you've worked with who do really well. What are some things that they are incorporating into their recovery maintenance program?
I think the motivation piece is really important. So if people have a good why and they've really engaged with why they want to kind of stick the course, and I definitely see that in the work that I do with David as well, that where you can help people to identify that, or they may be coming along with that anyway, which might be, it's often things around family, like I need to be well. There may be a lone parent, I need to stay well, I need to not be doing this to myself because I've got someone else to look after, or they want to be well enough to help with the grandchildren, or whatever it is personally. But I think where people are coming with a strong purpose and motivation for change and for getting somewhere different, and for not wanting to repeat history over and over again, I think that's an important one. But I think, as I say, it's sometimes hard to tell who's going to do well and who won't. You go ahead, Heidi, while I try and think if there's any other factors that seem to predict doing well.
Yeah, no, I think the motivating one, as you say, is definitely a number one. There has to be that strong motivation, and very often, ideally, if the motivation is beyond just I want to lose weight, it has to be more than that, really, because then all the diet bit comes back into it again. But also, I think people, and I think we've seen this in our groups, haven't we, that people who really do seem to be to be looking at the food addiction concepts that we present and discuss with them, and then taking it home and thinking further about it, and actually saying, how does this relate to me? How does it relate to my experiences from the past? How does it relate to my life today? And now I'm going to start to practice it. And then who come back in the sessions and start and talk about how they have, they're starting to utilize what we've been discussing as theory. I think those people are the ones that possibly are more likely to succeed, because they're not being just passive absorbers. They are actually participating and giving themselves thinking time. And Jen, I love the word. You use this word, let it percolate. And I think that's a beautiful word to use for it. They actually let it percolate while they are thinking and working with the concepts. I think that engagement part is very, very important.
Yeah, I've just thought actually of the people who don't tend to do so well, in my experience, are the people who at home have other people who are absolutely not ready to engage with this kind of talk, and may have their own issues around food or other things, and are not supported but are kind of undermining. So I'm thinking of one particular lady whose kind of whole marriage was sort of based on, and she even said that, that was how we, when we went on dates, it was all about food. Our relaxation is to sit in front of the telly and eat. She was an incredibly good cook, so they were all used to her sort of producing delicious meal. I mean, she still did that, but she did try for a while to make them low carb, but it was a real struggle for her, because the husband and the son were sort of undermining the efforts. They didn't want the change. They didn't particularly want her to change, so it was really hard for her. And in the end, I had to just say, come back when you want to have another go, really, because she just was, just wasn't possible. So I think the home environment's incredibly important, and if you've got people at home who are willing to support you and to kind of back you up because they see what an issue it's been for you, that's going to be a massive sort of catalyst and help to change. Whereas the opposite is also true. If you've got people at home that have their own problems, or don't, for some reason don't want that change to happen, there's going to be a lot of pushback in the system, and then it's difficult for people.
Yeah, I would agree. In my clients as well. I think I've seen similar things for sure. So thinking about, how you guys work with clients, what for you guys right now, what works best, what doesn't work well, the things you have to be flexible with, your unique perspectives that you bring to the field, these factors of success or those who might struggle. What do you think is missing in the food addiction treatment field? So speaking to other clinicians who are out there practicing, maybe even researchers, whomever, what is missing for us in this field?
Data. Massively. So when you look at all the studies, I looked at all the studies up until the kind of end of last year. There's very few on actual treatment. There's some papers that sort of suggest things that should work. CBT should work because it works with eating disorders. Keto should work. Because there was a case series study, wasn't there? It came out last year. So there's that, but there's very little actual data presented. And even obviously groups like Overeaters Anonymous, they don't collect data, so they can't publish it, even if it was effective. So we're a little bit sort of fumbling around in the dark in terms of actual outcomes from individual treatments or groups and being able to compare treatments. So we're right at the infancy of really understanding what works. It's really just a clinical field at the minute, with the sort of research which says, it does this to, sugar can do this to your brain, or that, we can use that research, but we really haven't got the outcome. So for me, that's the priority now.
Yeah. And I so agree with that. But for me to add to that is I'm so disappointed that it's still not recognized as a criteria of disease. And I mean, it's it is a bit beyond me that it still isn't, with all that evidence. I mean, we've presented now between us, with your help, to the WHO, and requested to include food addiction or actual harmful use of foods as a criteria of disease, just as we have to, as currently exists for alcohol and drugs and even caffeine. And yet food, I don't know, have we done the comparison of the amount of evidence for caffeine compared to the amount of evidence for food? I don't know, we've compared the two, but I suspect there is an awful lot more for food than there is. So, and that, to me, then the fact that it's not recognized as a disease also means that what's lacking is some sort of what would you say, some structure and commonality of approach and standards for treatment. So it worries me, and I think it's incorrect that it should be left like this. You know, I feel that it's an area that really does need some form of regulation as soon as possible to help both so that the more research can be done to build more evidence, but also so that we can deliver the kind of quality solutions that we know are going to work.
And we can say to people, you know, if you, on the whole, if you do this group, these are the outcomes. You know, like you could for any other mental health treatment. Now we've got enough evidence to say, you know, if you do this CBT for eating disorders, there's loads of evidence, you know, this is likely to, you know, on the whole, you're absolutely right, Heidi. And until it's recognised, there won't be money for research or services or anything. You know, that's why there isn't any research, because it's not a category that people can apply for grant money to research. So that's why there isn't any.
Yeah, absolutely. Or no funding for treatment if it's not a diagnosis at this time, right?
Yeah.
So we have a signature question, because you guys kind of expanded on what your hopes are for the future in terms of, like, obviously getting best practice standards and getting it in the ICD would be beautiful. So if you could tell your younger selves something about food addiction or food addiction recovery, what would that be?
Do you want to go, Heidi, or shall I?
I was going to say, I want to jump in though, because Jen has already answered this question for us. And so I have a different one for Jen. So if Heidi wants to go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Heidi. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Oh goodness. If I could tell myself, there's so much, you know, in a way, I would rather you said, not just tell a younger version of myself, but what could I have told my mother, you know? If she, you know, she did her absolute best to bring us up, and we had lots of wonderful food at home, but we learned to bake, and, you know, we learned that butter and sugar was really the base for an awful lot of really delicious stuff, but butter and sugar on its own was fine as well. So, you know, if I could have turned back time for that and helped her, that would have been my biggest wish. And, you know, interestingly, a very personal situation there, but it would have helped her too, because she has Alzheimer's disease now, and she is definitely a classic example of somebody who's dieted through a lot of her life, or been worried about eating too much fat, not so much the cakes and the breads and all these kind of foods that we now know to be so addictive. But yeah. So what else? So that's probably one of them. To myself, I suppose should have said that don't, just because this rubbish food doesn't make you fat, don't eat it. It is damaging you potentially beyond repair. It's damaging your brain. So if I could have said that to myself, maybe I would have scared myself into stopping much, much earlier. If I'd been able to make that connection, who wants to lose their confidence in, we all want the opposite. But I was destroying my own confidence because of what I was eating and out of control of eating. So probably that would be the main thing I would say.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. So Jen, what is something?
Fine.
Yeah, I know, right? I know. I just came up with it as we were chatting because I was like, oh no, Jen's answered this question. What is something you maybe needed to hear early on in your journey? So almost like speaking to people who are just getting started that maybe would have been helpful for you to have heard when you kind of had that aha, and then here we go. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's important to be brutally honest with yourself about the things you can't moderate. It's so hard to do, isn't it? But if you can genuinely, the freedom comes when you've kind of cut out the stuff you need to cut out. And I think early on people what you don't see is beyond the wall, if you like. You probably have to do this stuff, but you can't really understand until you've got there the joy of not being chained by these obsessions and these cravings and this hunger and everything. You think, oh, I've got to give this up, oh, I've got to give that up, oh, misery, and my life's going to be miserable, even though you've got to do it. Or you don't realize that actually it's really joyous once you manage to do it. So I would just encourage people to, if there's something you can't moderate. So one example for me was peanut butter. So even though that's kind of keto, it just was impossible for me to have that in the house. And if I'd only just got a grip earlier and said, right, just don't buy it, don't try and struggle with it, just life is okay. You can live a really happy life without peanut butter, people. There's loads of other delicious things to eat. Don't be too sad. So I think it would be, if you've got weird behaviors around something, that's the thing. And we often say this to patients in David's practice, that's probably the thing you need to give up. So when they say to him, they're literally crying in the clinic, I can't live without bread, that is the thing you need to, put on your big girl pants, as you guys say. And, there's worse things in the world than living without bread. There's loads of food to eat that you're not going to behave in that way with, that hasn't got that sort of addictive reaction to the brain. So, yeah, I think it's about seeing, you can't know it, but keeping that hope alive that what's beyond the giving up is actually worth the giving up. So I would say to my slightly younger self, it's going to be fine, because you're going to have to. I have given up a lot of things because I'm pretty rock bottom, as Judy Wolfe would say. I'm a pretty rock bottom sugar addict, but having given up those things, it's definitely worth it. 100% worth it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that so much.
Yes. And I especially loved, Heidi, your answer, like first speaking to your mother and then to yourself and saying, even if as a younger person, as a young little girl, to be able to say that. And I think so many of us have a history like that, where if we could have just shown up for our family members, of course we can't know, but yeah, just to say like, it's not worth it.
I often, my mother's no longer with us, and she was definitely a food addict. We shared those behaviours together, and I often think, I just wish, if only she'd lived a bit longer and I could have told her about it, she would have loved it. Actually, she would have totally got it. She would have done it. She would have understood the science, and she would have felt so much better. She struggled all her life with her weight, and it made her miserable. She put on weight and lost weight as well. She just never was around long enough to find the answer, because I think back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it was all about the low fat, and that was just the polar opposite of the right advice for people like her and us. So I really, I really empathize with that, Heidi. I so wish I'd been able to tell her what we've all found out and what a difference it makes.
Yeah. I wish I could tell my mother too. She won't. She can't.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's,
Yeah.
yeah. But there we go. But that's why we're doing this, ladies.
This is why we're sharing this with the
This is
world,
it.
right? To
Yeah, and it's
help
why
all
we're
the mothers
passionate.
and the children.
Yes.
And also they'd be delighted to know that's what we've done. You know, they really would.
Yeah, they'd be so proud of us.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, ladies. And we'll make sure to have all your information, and we'll get it linked when we post this in the Facebook group and the show notes later when this becomes a podcast episode. And just this, I'm just so honored, and thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. And thank you for everything that you do and for the podcast, which is just superb. It's really so important.
Yeah, it's important to more and more people every single day. You must know that. But so it's an amazing job you do. And thank you for having us on.
Yeah,
what an
thank you.
honor.
We're honored. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today on the Food Junkies Food Addiction Summit.
If you would like to hear more, tune in every Friday to the Food Junkies podcast, available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, and anywhere else you listen to your favorite podcast. Subscribe so you'll never miss a show.
Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon.
If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. Their websites and email addresses are available at foodjunkiespodcast.com.
As Vera always says, the power is ours.